Over the weekend on Daily Debrief, we were talking about how US China relations are critical to the overall security scenario on the continent of Asia. Today, in the context of two minor incidents between the two nations' militaries in the South China Sea, we ask why the world's most powerful military cries foul every time a sovereign nation questions its so-called freedom of navigation. 21-year-old Muselelo Makabela, a Central Committee member of the banned Communist Party of Swaziland, who had been organizing anti-monarchy resistance underground after escaping police custody with a bullet wound, was arrested in April and tortured once again. But will the last absolute monarch in Africa be able to fend off the strength of the people's movement against his rule? And Zlatan Ibrahimović, one of the world football's most definitive as well as divisive figures, has called time on an illustrious 24-year career. He would no doubt laugh at the knowledge that he only made it onto the show as our last story of the day. But we asked Leslie Xavier, a longtime sports journalist who's also been to Sweden and covered the Zlatan story, what made the giant Swede, giant both of course physically and metaphorically, so very special. Our first story of the day, two incidents over the past few days between the US and Chinese militaries have taken place, after both of which the US called out China for intercepting apparently too aggressively a naval ship and an RC-135 spy aircraft, the first of which took place around the same time as the US Secretary of Defense refused to engage with the Chinese defense minister at a security conference in Singapore. I quote a Chinese military spokesperson now who says that the US is clear about the reason why China-US military dialogue faces difficulties. He goes on to say the US should earnestly respect China's sovereignty, security and interest concerns, immediately correct wrong practices, show sincerity and create the necessary atmosphere and conditions for dialogue and communication between the Chinese and US militaries, end quote. Anish, of course, follows relations between the US and China and will join us now to talk about these two incidents and the wider impact that they might have. Anish, we were talking last week on the show about how another opportunity was missed for dialogue between the Chinese and US militaries. And unsurprising given sort of the spate of incidents that keeps taking place and, with each side, of course, blaming the other in entirety for what is going on. The US military once again crying foul after coming into some kind of close-ish contact with Chinese forces. Tell us what exactly happened. First, the naval incident, and of course, before that, a US spy plane as well being intercepted by Chinese aircraft.
So in the case of the naval incident, basically there was a U.S. military and U.S. and a Canadian naval ship trying to make passage through the Taiwan Strait, and in that they came into very close contact about what the U.S. military claims is about 137, less than 150 yards away from them. So, which is quite close when you consider like large, because both of these were destroyers, and so definitely these are massive ships that like were 137 yards. It's not a big deal. So, like the fact that it came that close is definitely concerning. But there are also questions about a first of all, what was the purpose of these two ships being about 8,000 miles away from their home country? And secondly, there's also the fact that this is now one of the most common incidents that is happening in Taiwan, where you have a very common Taiwan being used as a very common transit route by the US on multiple occasions. Last week we definitely talked about we have that in the story as one of our stories as well. We covered how there was this US reconnaissance plane which was which was flying very close to the Chinese coast in the South China Sea. Now, in both cases, the US claims that it was just transiting through these places. Now, the question is that like there is what is the purpose of such transit, and that is where like China is trying to assert both its sovereign rights over these seas, and the waters that we're talking about may not be territorial waters, but definitely they are sovereign waters. and the language that both sides are using, which is also quite concerned, which is primarily also the reason why there is a massive conflict and definitely a great deal of confusion in the manner in which these incidents are covered.
So the larger story, Anish, of course, is about the conversation between the two sides. The US, again, calling these movements freedom of navigation exercises, essentially a freedom of navigation that it seems the US military is entitled to more than anyone else in the world, because if, let's say, you or I were to take a warship that close to the mainland United States, I think there might be a couple of issues that would be raised. In that context, how do you sort of frame the discussion, and are you at all surprised at, like the Chinese military spokesperson was saying, the complete lack of dialogue? Because it seems like there is no even attempt to say that, okay, there are two sides involved in this entire discussion.
Well, first of all, I think like there is the narrative problem, which is the fact that the kind of language that is being used by both sides, there is no agreement with even the terminology that is being used. For instance, China uses claims sovereignty over the entirety of the Taiwan Strait, and claims that it has sovereign rights under the UN CLOS, which is the Convention of the Law of the Seas,
Sees.
which is something that the US is not party to, but China is, and they the convention actually clearly talks about passage rights, innocent passage, an innocent passage which has very specific conditionalities, where or any kind of passage stops being innocent passage when there is a certain kind of military or a defense threat to the coastal country in question. Now, that is definitely one of the that is the only language that both the countries are kind of agreeing on, which is that there is a matter of innocent passage, while China does not agree that there is innocent passage engaged when it comes to US or any other military ships in the region. And while US keeps claiming that whatever ships that we sail through is entitled to innocent passage. Now, secondly, there is the question of legality of these movements and whether or not China has the right to defend itself. Now, that is also another part of the problem, because if you look at it, the Taiwan Strait, in on definition perspective, does not really fall entirely under territorial waters. A country can only claim about 12 nautical miles from its coast baseline as territorial waters. So and the entirety of the Taiwan Strait, I think, is about something like 97 nautical miles. So it is not entirely territorial, but definitely it comes under the EEZ, like the exclusive economic zone definition, and the entirety of the Taiwan Strait comes under that. And considering the fact that, like, whether it be the government in Taiwan or China, who both claim to be China, let's begin with that, and who both claim sovereignty over each other, also claim sovereignty over the entirety of the Taiwan Strait. These waters definitely fall within the definition of an EZ. Now, an EZ doesn't mean that you can use military ships in that region, but you have sovereign rights over its resources. And you can also deny any kind of passage rights which are not protected under the innocent passage clauses. So in those cases, like, there is certain aspect of truth, and there is also certain aspect of legitimacy with which China is operating in these waters, even in South China Sea. When we talk about the spy plane flying very close to its mainland coast, we're not even talking about the disputed South China Sea territories. We're talking about the mainland coast, and the fact that these such maneuvers are being highlighted by China, but are justified by the US as sort of innocent passage or any kind of whatever navigation rights that they're talking about, is the part of the problem. But the larger focus, obviously, is the fact that they do want to have more confrontational position, especially the United States, considering the fact that even these two ships were not part of any exercises, they were not part of any kind of joint patrols or anything with either Taiwan or any of the other countries in the region. They have not even involved in trade or any other kind of purposes that can be considered as innocent passage, on its face value. Shows that this sort of movement by the US and its allies is pretty much focused on creating confrontations with China and the supposed assertion of navigation rights in the region, because obviously let's also begin with the fact that a third of global trade passes through this narrow sea point. So definitely all of them are concerned, but the fact that you're trying to create military confrontations in the region by making about dozens of annual military passages through that area shows that you're more concerned about confrontation and making a point rather than actually resolving the matter in a more sustainable manner. And that is something and that is where like even the concern of whether or not you want to communicate these passages also come in, right? If you are more concerned about confrontation, you're definitely not going to communicate it to the country that you're trying to confront with. And so this is also where the lack of communication comes in, because there is no intentionality between the US primarily, but also in some part China, where they do not really want to talk on a certain set of matters because there are obviously very clear-cut areas of dispute here, and both the sides have never agreed upon what they actually or the kind of narrative that they use. So this is where the confrontations are happening, and the fact that these confrontations are increasing now. We are talking about two incidents in the span of less than 3 days, and major incidents, major maneuvers. It shows that we are going to see more and more confrontations, and that is not going to be good for the region or for the world itself.
Major in the sense at least that if one small thing were to go wrong, it could lead to a much greater conflagration of the conflict. And of course, I guess on the US side, it helps not to be signed up on international law on all of these issues. So, you have to make your own rules. All right, Anish, thanks very much for your time. We'll leave it there for today. As always, thank you for covering the region and bringing those insights to Daily Debrief. Right, next up on the show, we're talking about the last remaining absolute monarchy in Africa, Swaziland, where the Communist Party of Swaziland, the banned Communist Party of Swaziland, is set to launch a Break the Chains campaign to demand the release of all political prisoners, including, of course, its Central Committee member, the 21-year-old Muselelo Makgabela, whose bail hearing is now scheduled for the 22nd of June. The campaign will include protests and roadblocks in rural communities, beginning with the small town of Fluti in the Hosea constituency in Shiselweni, which is the poorest region in rural Swaziland, and also the region where the activist organized and launched movements against the monarchy. In the course of his work, Muselelo has been tortured many times by the police, including being shot. Prashant is in studio now to talk about, of course, the activist himself and his case, but the wider struggle against the monarchy in Swaziland. Prashant, the so-called parliamentary elections are, of course, the focus of a lot of the pro-democracy opposition that has come up. Tell us about maybe a little bit about how the elections are held and why I'm saying so-called elections, and of course the Break the Chains campaign as well.
Right. So, Swaziland, of course, a very small country, but nonetheless, it's been in the midst of a very interesting and unfortunately violent process over the past many years, and it's an absolute monarchy, maybe the last one in Africa. And the king controls a huge part of the economy. The king and his family and associates also. There's a lot of wasteful spending in the name of keeping up the royal magnificence, so to speak. And even the so-called democracy that is there is completely controlled by the king. So only basically candidates nominated, approved by the chiefs, get to contest. And so basically it is a structure which there's a namesake parliament, but the feudal system still remains very much front and center in Swaziland. So it's for that reason that many sections in Swaziland have been opposing this election for the longest time, calling it a complete sham and a farce as far as they're concerned. And so there have been protests that have been taking place over the past many years on the demand of democracy itself. Now it's important to note that these are demands which have brought together a variety of groups. So there are, of course, activists, what is called pro-democracy activists include trade unions, for instance. They include government servants, for that matter. There's a very powerful student movement in Swaziland, which is also involved in these protests. So altogether, it is at various points, it has reached the level of a mass upheaval. In fact, at some point, the king was actually forced to flee the country, and around that time, his soldiers, I believe, killed over 80 to 100 people, people who were protesting at that point of time. So it's in this context that I think the Communist Party of Swaziland and other forces, they have been sort of running a campaign to boycott the elections, which are scheduled for August, calling them a farce. And the repression has been very intense against them and similar activists, because anybody who sort of the state has identified that this challenge to the elections is very problematic for them in various ways, because it challenges the very core of the legitimacy itself. So the case we're talking about, the very young activist Moselelo, who is just 21 years old, in the past 3 months he's been arrested thrice, and he's currently in jail. This is his third arrest in recent times, and in each of these cases it was for protesting these elections. And it's very sad story of a 21-year-old really, who who for years has been fighting for democracy in Swaziland, has been arrested. Each time, at least the last 2 times he was arrested, he was quite brutally tortured as well. And the last updates about his health were also quite worrying. So, there's often actually not too much focus on political prisoners in countries like Swaziland, because they don't get so much media attention as well. But it's a very important story, because we have a country, we have a populace which is really sort of struggling to end a monarchy, and the outright repression being unleashed by the forces. So that's the context in which the party's Break the Chains campaign is going on, demanding the release of political prisoners. And I think it's it's one of those processes we need to sort of follow very closely as well, because it does look like over the past few years especially, there's been like I said, a widespread legitimacy crisis for the royal system. And one sign of it is the fact that the protests are not only now being held in the cities or on university campuses, they're spread to rural areas as well, which were once considered far more pro-monarchy, so to speak. So we can see actually, I think this process accelerating. There are the state has tried some attempts to sort of conduct negotiations or whatever. But overall, I think as far as the long arc of history, so to speak, is concerned, the pro-democracy protests, the kind of, and which have many radical elements in them, which are calling for more than just the establishment. And that's a very interesting stage, because many of the forces which are leading these protests are saying that it's not enough to just set up a classical democratic state where those
Western parliamentary democratic
that
system.
Exactly, where basically the old powers continue to dominate through various ways, but they're calling for far more sustainable change in terms of how land is distributed, in terms of how resources are used. So this is actually a very important moment, because even though it's a very small country, the maybe achievement of some of these goals, when it happens, could be a very powerful moment for, in fact, the entire continent as well. So I think a very important story to notice. But in the meantime, I think equally important to highlight the case of such a young political activist who has, I think the article by Pawan actually mentions a lot of it, which is, the various struggles he has participated in, of students, of government employees, for democracy. So a very important struggle, I think, to keep the eye on.
And the extent to which, of course, the state is trying to fight it off. All right. We'll leave it there, Prashant, but thanks very much for that update on Swaziland on the show. And finally, Swedish footballer Zlatan Ibrahimovic, one of the most recognized figures in men's football, men's sport maybe around the world, has called time on a professional playing career that lasted as many as 24 years, during the course of which he played, of course, for clubs such as Ajax of Amsterdam, Juventus, AC Milan, where he, of course, finally ended his career. Also in the United States, he also played with PSG and Barcelona, so some of the biggest clubs in the world. And, of course, did his part for the national team of Sweden as well. One of my personal biggest disappointments in covering world football was Zlatan's exclusion or non-inclusion, whichever way you look at it, from the Sweden squad at the 2018 FIFA World Cup men's finals in Russia. But to talk about the man, the footballer, the way he called time on his career, and of course the legacy he leaves behind, we're joined via video conference by Leslie Xavier, senior sports journalist. Leslie, good to see you on Daily Debrief. Hope you're doing well. In typical Zlatan fashion, Leslie, while some of the greatest men's footballers around, whether it's Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi, now even talk of Karim Benzema. There was a story in the New York Times recently talking about how the Saudi League is planning a multi-billion-dollar war chest to hire or to bring in some of the world's biggest name footballers. Zlatan, in a fashion that has been his, I guess, through this long 2+ decade career as a professional footballer, decided to say, I'm done. You know, I don't know, what do we say?
But yeah, it's also due, right? Long due, because he has also been struggling of late with injuries, and he was benched for the longest time. He came back, he played, he scored again, became the oldest person in Serie A to score a goal. So yeah, so I guess it's not surprising. It's not shocking that way, but also it came sudden, and that's how Zlatan is, I guess. And it's also proving to the world in a way that I'm going in my terms. He has been struggling the last few months. He has been struggling last few seasons rather with injuries, niggles, and coming up. And there was a long period last year where he was out of action, and then he came back. He scored again, became the oldest player to score in Serie A, and then yeah, call it quits. He does things his own way. That's the hallmark of Zlatan that we know of over the years, that we have enjoyed his play, enjoyed his antics rather, enjoyed whatever he says, whatever he writes, things like that. So it's typical that he went out in his own way, and it doesn't matter uh, whether it was today, whether it was 2 seasons later, taking some Arab money or whatever. But he did it, and that's it.
Yeah, the Zlatan way. Among the, everyone writes a book these days, and Zlatan's is, of course, called I Am Zlatan, and is also unsurprisingly an honest account of his childhood as the child of a migrant family, Yugoslav migrants settled in Sweden, playing in small town sort of Malmo, and how football was, of course, always the thing he was going to do in life. You've also been to Sweden on a reporting assignment, of course, and examined Zlatan's sort of ties with his homeland, with the country that he has represented at the international level, um, and its people. What do you make of that legacy, Leslie, and any sense that you have of what Ibrahimovic's continued interaction with the football world will be? Because, like he said in his speech, if we're lucky, we will see him around.
In that sense, yeah, we are lucky. He has always been an entertainer. He has always been an intriguing and also a polarizing figure that way. And I went to Sweden. It was 2014, and just after he just lit up the new Friends Arena, the Swedish National Football Stadium in Stockholm, with those 4 goals against England. That was during the qualifier for the World Cup. And he was captain of the Swedish national team when I was there. And so I was trying to explore this idea of Zlatan Ibra. What is he? What is he to people? What is he to? I went in with a preconceived notion that he would be the hero of the immigrants, because he played there. He broke the shackles, so to speak, and despite all uh, uh, the things that he faced growing up, violence, a bit of, he almost led into a world of crime. So, and then, but still, football, being a great footballer, being a talent, he just worked hard and fought. He was always a fighter as a kid, and that fighting spirit he channelized into the game and then came out on top. So, but then surprisingly, when I was there, it so came out that the Swedish nationals, they were loving him more than the immigrants. The immigrants were a divided lot. Of course, some of them loved him, but some of them said that it's not right. But even among the Swedes, at least 90%, I would say. Of course, I spoke to a wide variety of people from various strata, but including sociologists, including businessmen, including professionals, including youngsters, and some sports persons as well. And some of them express this idea that he is far from Swedish in many ways because Swedish culture is all about the team. But Zlatan is an individual, stands out. But then when he became the captain of the Swedish national team, he showed that side of it where he played with pride, which made him very popular, sort of like a cult figure in Sweden.
Thanks for giving us a little bit of insight into what Zlatan was all about, Leslie. And I think we can spend the rest of the day maybe watching some of that incredible career in various YouTube videos. That's all we have on this episode of the Daily Debrief from Leslie, myself, and the entire team here at People's Dispatch. As always, thank you for watching. We ask you to, of course, head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for details on these stories and all of the other work we do. Don't also forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice for regular updates. We'll be back tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.